Welcome to Hustle and Flow with Heather Hubbard, episode number 19. Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard, and I was a litigator, partner, and practice group leader at an AmLaw 200 firm. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your personal life. So how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you embrace your ambition without selling your soul? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Hello and welcome back. I am your host, Heather Hubbard, and today we are talking about changing your mind. And I'm not talking about, changing your mind about a certain position or just, something random that you would be deciding in your life. I'm talking about literally changing your mind, your brain. And if you listened to episode 10, I shared with you some of the neuroscience behind meditation and how it can literally change your brain. And I told you then that we would do an episode on mindfulness, and that's what we're covering today. How do you change your mind? So I used to stay stuck in my head, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute, but I just thought that was normal. And I really didn't think there was anything I could do about it. And mindfulness totally changed not just my mind, but my life. Because what I learned was that all of the stuff that was going on in my mind, it wasn't necessarily real. Okay, if you're thinking, what is she talking about? She has lost her mind. I'm going to tell you all about it. And mindfulness, I think, is starting to become a little bit more popular in the professional world. So if you're not familiar with what it is, I'm going to share it with you today. And let me give you a heads up. Normally, when I do a CLE or a workshop on mindfulness, like just an introductory workshop, it's 90 minutes. And this podcast is only 30 minutes. So this is going to be very high level. I'm going to give you just some basic foundations, but know that there's a lot more to this. And if it interests you, I'm going to encourage you to check out the free download for this week. It's the resource guide that I provide for my CLEs, and you can download it. So you just have to go to hustleandflowpodcast.com/19, and you can get a free copy. Okay, so what exactly is mindfulness? Well, first off, it has been around for thousands of years, and it really derives from Buddhist principles. And for that reason, it really didn't become popular in the West until Jon Kabat-Zinn founded what's called the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, often referred to as NBSR, at the University of Massachusetts in 1979. Now, when he started this in 1979, it was pretty cutting edge. It wasn't fully embraced, but it's becoming super popular. And a lot of hospitals and physicians now have and support NBSR programs, especially for people with chronic pain. So it is becoming more popular. There is science, there is research to support it. And for us Westerners, apparently that is what then allows us to embrace it. So, despite the reasons why you may or may not accept it, I don't care. I personally know it works. It certainly has worked for me. So I encourage you to at least keep an open mind and give it a try. So Jon Kabat-Zinn, he defines mindfulness as paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. I really like that definition. I'm going to repeat it again. It's paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. Okay, so first, paying attention. How many of you claim to be amazing multitaskers? Heads up, that's not paying attention. Paying attention means that you are focused. You are super focused on one thing. Okay, so no multitasking allowed. Next is on purpose. So it's not just that you are, paying attention to a crisis because it's just right in front of you. Like you are doing it on purpose. You're being intentional about the paying of attention to something. For me, the purpose piece is really about awareness or a higher level of consciousness. And this may be seeming a bit ethereal, but just stick with me. Okay, so next, in the present moment. That means you are intentionally paying attention to what is going on in the present moment, not what just happened, not what's on your to-do list, not what might happen, but what's going on right now. And very few of us are ever in the present moment. We are always ruminating on the past or replaying things in our minds, or we're future tripping, right? So this is about just paying attention to what's happening around you and what you're feeling in the moment as well. Okay, and then the last piece, non-judgmentally. This can be really hard for lawyers. We are trained to be judgmental, and we are super critical. So it's not just being non-judgmental of what's going on around you, but being non-judgmental of your own thoughts and feelings. Okay, so this may all be sounding, again, a bit heady, but we're going to break it down and I'm going to put it into perspective with some real life examples. So for me, at its core, the way I always try to explain it to people is it's just about creating space. So many of us just react. We don't stop. And when we don't stop to create space, then we're not responding, we're reacting, right? We just have these knee-jerk reactions to all kinds of things. And it keeps us totally stressed out. And we're like this tight ball. And when you're mindful, it allows you to create space to see things a bit more clearly and to process your emotions in a more intentional and thoughtful way. So part of creating space is learning to observe your thoughts. And at first, this can sound really weird, but once you get the hang of it, it seems like second nature. It's almost like riding a bike. So a lot of times we think that everything that comes up in our head, right? Every single thought we have is a fact, that it's true, when it's actually an opinion and it's likely completely made up. And when you learn that that voice in your head is not you, it's just a voice, then you can learn to watch and observe that voice. Okay, how many of you are thinking right now, she's crazy? I just want you to kind of pay attention though, just for today. Pay attention to your thoughts. I bet your mind goes 1,000,000 miles a minute. Like it never stops. It is so full of chatter. And if you try to just sit still, like the voice like really gets loud and chatty then, right? So if you've ever tried to meditate, you may have like closed your eyes. In your mind, you hear this voice that's like, I can't do this. This is boring. Hey, can we talk about the other things that you've got to do? But it is a voice, right? Like it's not you. And that is the first step to mindfulness, is recognizing that that voice is just a voice. It is not you, and it is not fact. And when you can learn to observe it from a third person perspective, that's what gives you the power to create space. So in many ways, I now think of that voice in my head like a child. And when you can learn to see it from that perspective and you hear it chatting, you can try to say, it doesn't always work, I'm going to need you to go sit in the corner for a little bit, or I need you to go play with your friends, right? It's giving yourself the ability to take back your mind and shut off all of the crazy chatter. Okay, so here's an example of what I mean by it's not real. That voice in our head, it is generally fueled by fears, a lot of old fears, right? It's also really judgmental of you and others. So anytime I have a thought or a judgmental thought anymore. Because I'm now so mindful, that voice has gotten trickier. It's very manipulative. It now, anytime I have a judgmental thought, will say, don't be a B. I mean, hello, isn't that still critical? I mean, it's being critical of me, but it's trying to still be in charge, and it's trying to still be loud. So the way that it shows up now is trying to make me think, oh, well, that's not very mindful for you to be judgmental. But the constant, reminder that I'm a B, hello, that's pretty judgmental as well. So anyway, I know that this probably sounds really weird, but if you'll just start to recognize and follow your thoughts and see that you are not in control of them at all, they have literally a mind of their own and will say anything, it really helps you recognize that it is crazy. It will go to crazy town really quick, and it's often not true. So how often does something happen where you wish that you would have said something differently, right? So you're in a conversation and someone makes you really mad, or they just say something really stupid, and then that's all you can think about. You're trying to do your work, you're trying to drive down the road, you're trying to focus on other things, but the only thing you can really think about is that conversation and what happened. And you keep replaying what happened, and then you keep replaying what would have happened if you had said something differently. You're like, oh man, this was such a good zinger. I should have said this, right? And so then you replay that. So then you start to create a story of what could have been and how that would have turned out different. Can you see how that's crazy? It's completely made up. None of it is real. And yet, because that's where you're giving your attention, you're losing perspective and you're missing out on the present moment and what's happening around you. I used to be really, really bad about replaying things over and over in my head. And it was probably at its worst when I was in law school and just became an attorney. And I went to therapy for it. I shared in the last episode that I have been to therapy. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you need help, go get it. But I knew that these mind tricks, constantly ruminating, it was causing me a ton of stress and anxiety. And what's interesting is when I went to therapy for that, no one ever shared anything about mindfulness. And so what ended up happening was I was just kind of sharing what was going on and continuing to talk about the ruminating as opposed to getting an answer. And so that's not to diss therapy, but I do think that mindfulness in and of itself and combined with therapy is a beautiful thing because it teaches you that you don't just have to talk about it. You just have to recognize that it is a voice in your head that is not real. And when you acknowledge that it's not real and you try to bring yourself back to the present moment, that's where the peace comes in. So if you're not ruminating, you might be thinking about what's going to happen. So let's say you have a trial or a job interview, or maybe a difficult conversation with a client where you've made a mistake or you have to fire them, or, anything that's stressful like that. Oftentimes, we don't just show up in the moment to be present and then experience it. We will absolutely ruin minutes, days, sometimes weeks or months by thinking about all of the things that might happen. We prepare for, well, if this person says this, I'm going to say this, right? We just keep going through all of these stories and we keep playing out all of these different scenarios. But because we're in the future, we're not in the present, we completely lose our sanity. And that's not real, right? I mean, surely we can all appreciate that. When we are thinking about something that happened and we're trying to replay it in our mind and change the story, or if we're focused on something in the future that may or may not happen, that is all make-believe. None of it is real. And that's the stuff that completely gets us stuck in our head and keeps us stressed out and keeps us anxious. If we can stay in the present moment, generally everything's okay. Now, sometimes really bad things are going on in the present moment, but that's actually few and far between. For the most part, in the present moment, everything is fine. So even if you've got a difficult situation, right? You could be going through a really difficult time where maybe you're having to file for bankruptcy and you're losing, maybe you're losing your house. That is a very difficult, stressful time. And yet, even with all of that, in the present moment, everything's probably fine, right? Like if you're not giving up your house in this minute, if you are not having to go to court in this minute, if you're not having to deal with a creditor in this minute, everything is fine. The vast majority of the time, in the present moment, everything is fine. But that's not where we live. We don't live in the present moment. We seem to stay stuck in the past or the future. And so mindfulness is simply being aware that that's our tendency and not getting angry, not getting frustrated, not judging it, just saying, okay, there goes my mind again. And then just redirecting it back to the present and saying, okay, in the present moment, is everything okay? Yes, I'm going to try to stay focused on the present moment. And every time you veer off, again, you're just non-judgmentally aware of what's happening and you bring it right back. You bring it right back to the present moment. And a lot about creating space is being able to catch when you're triggered. So for me, when I say being triggered, it means that something is said or done that causes a reaction in you, generally a knee-jerk reaction, that is way out of proportion to what's really going on. And I used to get triggered a lot. And I still do, right? The thing about mindfulness is you don't get rid of that crazy voice in your head. You don't get rid of being triggered. The only difference is that you're aware of when it happens and you're able to say, okay, I see what's happening. You create space so that you can then respond instead of react. So let me just give you a few examples of what it might mean to be triggered. I'm not sure if I've shared this before on the podcast, but I grew up in a really small town in Kentucky, and I really always felt out of place. I never felt like I belonged there. And in my mind, and this may not be true, this may be a story I have created, it wasn't often a very nice place because it just seemed very sexist and racist and very judgmental and righteous from a religious standpoint. And so as soon as I cross the state line from Tennessee to Kentucky, I tend to be triggered. As soon as I drive into my hometown, I tend to be triggered. Now, there is nothing going on when I cross that state line. There is nothing going on when I drive into that city. In the present moment, I'm not experiencing any racism or sexism or righteousness or unkindness, but the environment triggers a reaction in me based upon a prior experience that is not based in reality in the moment. I hope that makes sense. So that is an example of like an environmental trigger. I think a lot of people get triggered when they're reading emails because a lot of times you can't hear the tone and the context. And so you might read a certain sentence and you think that the person is being condescending or patronizing or rude, and it just triggers you, right? Like it makes you really mad. And that may not have been the intention at all from the sender, but you are triggered, right? Like you cannot even look at that email from a neutral perspective because you are just like, you are PO'd at the moment, right? And you might like send a rash email back, or you get all wound up and then you go complain to someone else and you're like, can you believe they said this? And if the other person's like, I'm not really sure that's what they meant, that might make you even more upset. Okay, so these are examples of being triggered. And here's how mindfulness works when you're being triggered. So when I cross that state line or I go into the city and I notice that my body is like tense and I'm taking shallow breaths and I'm stressed out, I can be aware in the present moment of what's going on with my body, of what's going on with my emotions, and I'm not judgmental about it. I just say, okay, this clearly is upsetting me, but is it real? And because I'm looking at it from a third person, I can say, no, that's not real. But I understand why you feel that way. But let's just focus on the present. Let's get back to the present and let's take a deep breath and let's breathe. And that helps you then move out of that place of fear, move out of that place of anxiety and stress, and just be present. And taking those big, deep breaths is really powerful in helping you focus on the present and realizing that there's nothing harmful happening in the moment. Similar to an email, if you get into a mindfulness practice, you are more likely to walk away, right? You're more likely to take a step back from that email. Maybe you count to 10. Maybe you go get a drink of water, or, you just go to the restroom or take a short walk, and then you come back to it and you say, I want to focus on this, and I want to be present, and I want to see what it's really about. And then you look at it again and you're like, okay, well, it could mean this, but it could also mean this. And I see that maybe I'm being triggered. I wonder what that's about. And then you can decide how to respond, if at all, right? So maybe your response is not then just, a quit back. Maybe it is a question. Maybe it's picking up the phone and saying, here's the way I took that. Is that really what you meant? Mindfulness is not about being in a zenned out meditative state all the time. Being mindful is about taking a step back and creating space so that you can see life more clearly, and so that you can try to stay in the present moment as much as possible. And while we're on the topic of a meditative state, there is mindfulness meditation. And there's a ton of meditation that is not from the mindfulness camp. I kind of talked about that in episode 10. But mindfulness is not just meditation. You certainly can meditate with mindfulness principles, but mindfulness is really more of a way of life. I think it's more easily integrated into your life if you have a practice, and that practice may include meditation or other formal exercises that you're doing to try to retrain your brain. Like anything, it's hard to make something second nature if you've not practiced it a lot, right? Normally things become super easy once you've repeated them over and over and over again. So that's where a formal practice comes in. It's important to train your brain so that you create more awareness. And then when you're in, a situation that triggers you or makes you ruminate or future trip, which by the way is like every 5 minutes, you can more easily just recognize it for what it is and create that space so that you're responding instead of reacting. So one last thing, our brains can only take in so much information. And I covered a little bit of this in the neuroplasticity, again, in episode 10. We tend to see and focus on what we want to. And unfortunately, for many of us, we have trained our brains to focus on negative things. And we've trained our brains to focus on people treating us poorly or always trying to manipulate us. And that means that's what we're going to see. And that's part of why a formal practice is so important to retraining your brain to see things more positively and to see opportunities and possibilities and alternative scenarios that are less likely to cause us to be stressed out and anxious. You want to be happier. If you want to be more peaceful, if you want to be less stressed and less anxious, you got to train your brain to start finding the things that are going to bring that to you. And mindfulness is certainly what helped me change my mind, literally and figuratively. And it has brought so much perspective and clarity and peace to my life. I used to be so reactive, crazy reactive, and I'm not anymore. And it's a beautiful thing, not just for my own sanity, but for my family and my friends. But this is why it's so important to take breaks, to give your mind a break. That includes short breaks and long breaks. So, the short breaks can be, again, like 5-minute practices, whether it's meditation or something else. And then we need those long breaks where we're going on vacation, where we're going on retreats to truly check out. Our mind really needs to check out to be able to create space and have perspective. So I covered retreats in episode 6 and the importance of vacations and not working during those vacations in episode number 13. So you can check those out if you'd like a little bit more background and my thoughts on taking that longer break for a retreat or a vacation. We often think that we don't have time for those things, but they are the very things that make us better lawyers and humans. So that's what I would leave you with. If you could use more perspective, more clarity, more peace, less stress, less anxiety, I really encourage you to look into mindfulness. And again, if you kind of need a place to get started, you can download for free the resource guide that I provide at the end of all of my CLEs. So that is hustleandflowpodcast.com/19. All right, so that's it for today's episode. Mindfulness has certainly changed my mind and my life, and I hope that it does the same for you. All right, I'll see you guys next week. Are you feeling stuck or frustrated in your career? Are you exhausted from trying to balance so many competing demands? Do you have big dreams and goals, but no time to focus on them? Then join me in a small group of female attorneys for the Life and Law in Balance retreats at Miraval. They're coming up in June and September. To learn more and register, go to lifeandlawinbalance.com. I'd love to meet you there.